The UK's Cybersecurity Centre has lost a deadly network virus. Once it falls into the wrong hands, the entire world will fall into an unprecedented crisis. But the legal shark was horrified to discover that his wife is very likely the insider who stole the virus. He is forced to make a choice between national duty and marital vows. Should he be loyal to the nation, or should he trust his wife? No more talking, let's start right here. The male protagonist's name is George, a senior agent. That night, he went to secretly meet his superior. Passing through the noisy crowd in the bar and then around the chaotic dance floor, George finally met his superior. The two went outside to talk in detail. The other person told George that his thoughts were correct. Indeed, a traitor had appeared within the team. George took the piece of paper. On it were 5 suspected individuals, and his wife, Catherine, was on that list. The reason the superior gave was very simple. Catherine is also a senior agent, has security clearance, motive, and capability. He could only report the truth. Previously, the UK's Cybersecurity Centre had lost the critical key device Severus. Once Severus is deployed as planned, thousands of innocent people will lose their lives. But George asked his superior to give him a week. He would definitely find the traitor. The condition for exchange was that the superior temporarily not report the list. The superior was silent for a moment, then finally nodded in agreement. They didn't expect that this meeting of theirs had been entirely witnessed by someone. A few days later, George finished cooking the dishes for the party, then went upstairs to find his wife Catherine. To catch the traitor, George invited the people on the list to attend the dinner. Including George and Catherine, the dinner had a total of 6 people. Catherine also knew there was a traitor in the organization. She originally thought George would start with a lie detector, but unexpectedly George chose a more discreet method. George told Catherine not to eat the Indian chickpea curry because he had put truth serum in it. Hearing this, Catherine paused, then nodded to show she understood. After all, among them, someone was lying. Meanwhile, the 4 invited guests gathered together. Among them, the black woman asked with some curiosity why they were gathering at this time, why only the 4 of them were invited, and with only 24 hours notice. But James felt it was normal because they all worked together in the same field. There were 2 married couples. This wasn't something amateurs could compare to. Not long after, the 4 arrived at George's house. After the dinner began, Catherine led the conversation, talking about how she participated in the Syrian cyber warfare in 2012, when she wrote code to infiltrate the enemy's central router, thereby paralyzing the entire system. Hearing this, Clarissa was immediately amazed. She had seen that incredibly sophisticated code before and didn't expect it was Catherine's all along. All 4 guests attending the party had eaten the Indian chickpea curry containing truth serum, and the things they said became increasingly bold. The round-faced man named Freddie suddenly revealed that George had surveilled his father, and his father was a womanizer who cheated frequently, rarely able to restrain himself. He was a high-level intelligence expert who acted very cautiously, having dedicated almost his entire life to intelligence work. Therefore, his civilian wife basically couldn't grasp any evidence. But unexpectedly, the son, being an agent, took action. After that, George filmed video evidence of his father's affair and played it during Sunday family dinner. This completely ruined his father's career and marriage. After all, who would want to hire an intelligence expert who could be defeated by a kid? George, anticipating the drug was about to take effect, suggested everyone play a little game. Everyone sat around the table. Each person, like making a New Year's resolution, set a resolution for the person to their right. For example, a personal issue to resolve like quitting smoking. The game began. Very quickly, it was the black woman's turn. The black woman was the department head. The person to her right, James, was a very ambitious employee. Therefore, the resolution the black woman proposed was for James not to think about vying for the #1 spot all the time. James said nothing, just smiled it off. But immediately after, the biggest conflict of the evening erupted, occurring between the couple Clarissa and Freddie. Freddie, having his misdeeds exposed in front of everyone, immediately felt a surge of shame and anger. Immediately after, he vented this anger onto his wife. So he began to attack Clarissa verbally, first denying the affair, criticizing Clarissa for slandering and smearing a kind man who truly loved and respected her. Clearly, this type of scum would never self-reflect. He then used Clarissa's family issues to attack her, intentionally hitting Clarissa's sore spot. But the eloquent Freddie didn't expect that he would be exposed by George right there, just like George had exposed his father. George directly stated the name of the hotel Freddie and his mistress frequented. George even knew Freddie often used department meeting times to secretly meet his mistress. Clarissa couldn't take it anymore, using a dinner knife to stab Freddie hard in the hand. The dinner party finally ended in an utterly ridiculous manner. After everyone left, Catherine guessed her husband had been a bit heavy-handed with the drug. George didn't refute it, but as he cleaned up the aftermath, he discovered a torn movie ticket in the trash. But according to the time on the ticket, Catherine should have been on an overseas business trip then. Could his wife really be the insider? George suppressed the suspicion in his heart, not showing it immediately. Meanwhile, George's superior rarely went home, but when he finished the glass of wine in his hand, his body began to convulse uncontrollably, finally dying tragically in the night. The next day, George got up a step earlier, having prepared breakfast. He pretended nothing had happened, asking his wife if she wanted to go see a movie. Catherine replied that on Wednesday, she had to go on a one-day overseas business trip. And when she heard George mention the name of the movie on the ticket, she also said she had never heard of it. However, George secretly slipped his employee ID card into his wife's handbag when she wasn't looking. After that, George arrived at work on time. He lied to the receptionist that he forgot his card and used his personal ID to get a temporary pass. George had just entered the office floor when Freddie came over and told him that the superior had died suddenly last night from coronary heart disease. But he was so young. How could he have heart disease? There was definitely something suspicious going on. Freddie also asked George if he knew what the superior had been researching recently. George certainly wouldn't tell a suspected insider. Immediately after, George went to Catherine's work floor, wanting to retrieve his employee ID card. Because Catherine was in a meeting in the conference room, she gave her employee ID card to George. George then went straight to his wife's office without stopping. George first put on rubber gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. Then, he immediately opened Catherine's computer, examining his wife's recent schedule. He discovered his wife would be on a business trip to Zurich this Wednesday, even marking specific coordinates. George quickly recorded the coordinates. After Catherine finished her meeting, she went to the black woman's office first. The two sat opposite each other talking in detail. The black woman, as the person in charge of the signals warfare department, needed to understand and record whether the agents had any psychological issues. Catherine told the black woman that her sleep was still irregular. Every night, she still needed to use under 3 milligrams of lorazepam to aid sleep. Hearing this, the black woman frowned slightly. The dosage and usage Catherine mentioned were just below the level she needed to report. Therefore, she suspected Catherine was hiding the actual situation. Catherine immediately denied this because she wouldn't intentionally deceive about this matter. Seeing this, the black woman had no other choice but to end the questioning and let Catherine return to work. At the same time, George, after work, went to his usual wild fishing spot. Fishing was his unique way to relieve pressure. When fishing while pondering problems, unexpected ideas would often emerge. George rowed a small boat to the middle of the lake. Fishing while recalling the events of the past few days, unexpectedly encountering misfortune, his fishing line broke. George turned his head towards the shore and discovered James had found him again. He hurriedly returned to the shore. Indeed, something major had happened. James said that their finance staff always cooperated with Revenue and Customs, periodically conducting comprehensive reviews of banks and tax haven countries to prevent one of their virtual identities from being used to open overseas accounts. Previously, there had never been any issues, but this time they unexpectedly discovered someone had used the alias Margaret to open an overseas account. This name was an alias used by the Federal Bureau of Investigation 20 years ago, clearly banned in the database. But just yesterday, a huge sum of 7 million British pounds was transferred out of the account. Therefore, one of them had stolen a secret identity and used this identity to receive 7 million British pounds. And the transfer destination of this huge sum was none other than Zurich. George's heart tightened. Clearly this matter once again pointed towards Catherine. In the evening, the couple went to the cinema to watch a movie. Throughout the screening, George silently observed his wife, discovering she seemed to have genuinely never seen this movie before. At dawn, George took Catherine for her business trip. Because it involved a secret operation, Catherine didn't tell George what she was going to Zurich for. But George, to eliminate suspicion about his wife, definitely had to clarify everything. So he immediately went to Clarissa's house in the night, wanting to ask Clarissa for a favor. Although Freddie and Clarissa had argued very fiercely that night, the two were still together now. One could only say they were well matched. Because Clarissa was in charge of monitoring the headquarters surveillance footage, George needed her tomorrow morning to briefly retask the surveillance angle and ensure it wasn't locked and recorded. After hearing this, Clarissa quickly said she couldn't do it. George patiently explained that during the brief surveillance handover window, the satellite could be used for other purposes without detection. George had successfully tried this during a previous mission. The next day, George arrived early at the place Clarissa had mentioned. He told Clarissa the coordinates he had recorded. Currently, The two only had 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Time waits for no one. Clarissa quickly used the satellite to start searching, finally locating a bench in some square in Zurich. Immediately after, Catherine appeared in their view. Clarissa immediately showed a gloating expression because she thought George was also being cheated on. Just then, a man sat down next to Catherine. George told Clarissa to keep zooming in, then proceed with facial recognition. Currently, only the last minute of the window remained. They needed to hurry. The next second, Clarissa looked up the man's identity. His name was Kulikov, a Russian. Then, Clarissa plugged lip-reading AI into the interface. Next, the two heard the content of the conversation. Catherine seemed to be buying something from Kulikov. Seeing only a few seconds left, Clarissa wanted to end the operation but discovered she couldn't exit the system at all. In the panic, she missed the window. Although after unplugging the AI she successfully exited, the image still displayed on the large screen. George told Clarissa not to panic. First, delete all operation logs. Ensure no trace was left. At the same time, Freddie, after seeing the content on the computer, hurriedly called George. George, after seeing it, was also extremely shocked. Immediately after, the superior convened a secret meeting. It turned out the Federation had recently been monitoring a Russian general named Vadim 24/7. He had been cooperating with a network of exiled warlords, plotting to overthrow the Russian government, which was struggling due to poor war management. There were rumors that Severus was in his hands. But strangely, early this morning, the satellite responsible for monitoring him suddenly switched, creating a 2-minute window. By the time everything returned to normal, Vadim had disappeared without a trace. How on earth did the enemy grasp the exact satellite switch time, unless there was an insider in the headquarters? Hearing this, George's heart felt like it would jump out. Who could have expected that what he and Clarissa did had unintentionally let a dangerous figure go? At this point, the leader mentioned Kulikov's name again. It turned out Kulikov was Vadim's subordinate. Afterward, the leader asked the lower-ranking personnel to leave the meeting room, leaving only George, Freddie, and James. The leader told the three that Vadim had probably obtained Severus, which was why they were monitoring Vadim. If Vadim managed to bring Severus back to Moscow, the consequences would be unimaginable. Severus is a polymorphic virus they co-researched and developed with the U.S. National Security Agency. It must be physically introduced into a nuclear reactor to bypass the air gap. But once infiltrated, it can lock down and melt down the reactor core, an extremely dangerous cyber weapon. But later they realized Severus couldn't leave the building. Otherwise, if leaked, other countries could also use it to cause nuclear disasters. At that time, U.S. security would face an extremely large threat. But now someone had helped Vadim divert attention so he could escape with the virus drive. The leader ordered the three to quickly find the insider, using any means necessary. After the meeting, George was still stunned. He didn't expect Clarissa to go directly to Freddie and tell him everything George had asked her help with. Meanwhile, Catherine boarded the plane to return. But when she arrived home, Freddie was already waiting at the door, telling her what had happened today. If Vadim successfully returned to Moscow, George would be held responsible, possibly facing a 35-year prison sentence. Freddie then asked Catherine if she knew why George had surveilled her. But Catherine didn't know either. In the evening, Catherine was lying in bed. George suddenly turned over. It turned out he felt he had been set up. Catherine also agreed. Clearly, this was a conspiracy targeting the couple. Someone was scheming against George, thinking he would act to protect his wife, and indeed that was the case. Because of this, George fell into the trap, unintentionally letting Vadim go. If investigated further, George would surely be considered the traitor. And Catherine, frequently associating with Kulikov, would certainly find it hard to escape entanglement. But the couple naturally wouldn't just sit back and wait for doom. The next day, George went to the wild fishing spot again. But this time he specifically called James over. The two got into the boat together and went to the middle of the lake. George told James he planned to arrange a series of lie detector tests. James didn't object, but he asked George who he suspected was the insider. George was silent for a moment, then slowly said, "It's still undetermined at present." James suddenly changed the subject, talking about the previous bank incident. According to his investigation, during this period, Margaret was the passport name Catherine used in 2008. Then the system had some errors. This passport was reused multiple times, even circulating for 10 years. At least 40 to 50 entry-exit records used this passport. Meanwhile, Catherine had a plan in mind to lure the snake out of its hole. She first went to Clarissa, asking her to provide Kulikov's phone movement trajectory. Then she secretly arranged to meet a good friend working at the CIA. After all, within the FBI currently, anyone could be the traitor. It turned out that after the previous meeting with Kulikov, she had secretly attached a tracking device to him. And this time she used her connections precisely to have the CIA dispatch a suicide drone, under the charge of endangering the nation, to assassinate Kulikov and Vadim. This way, no one could accuse her of having connections with the Russians, and it would also cut off the transport of Severus. It could be said, killing two birds with one stone. Immediately after, Catherine sought out her superior, Arthur, in a sushi shop. She understood very well that Arthur's hand was definitely in this matter. Otherwise, given her and George's status, how could they be harmed by subordinates? Catherine reminded Arthur that he must stop the operation immediately now. Arthur chuckled mockingly that Catherine was too late, telling her to go check the CIA drone's activity log. Catherine doing this was understandable. After all, once a meltdown occurred, countless innocent people would die unjustly. No matter how angry Arthur was, it was useless. At the same time, a drone was heading towards Kulikov and Vadim at extreme speed, then directly dropped a bomb. The violent explosion killed both instantly. Meanwhile, George began the lie detector tests one by one. Questions went from basic to in-depth, constantly changing throughout the process, occasionally asking suddenly, "Was it you who stole Severus?" Throughout this process, everyone's emotional fluctuations were faithfully displayed on the computer. But very quickly, George noticed something unusual. The others all had intense emotional fluctuations, but only Clarissa's indicators remained very stable. Clarissa's calmness, conversely, aroused George's suspicion. He immediately increased the intensity. After questioning, he learned that Clarissa had read books on how to beat lie detectors, using physiological responses to stabilize her emotions. After finishing the tests, George invited everyone to his house for dinner again. If Arthur was the mastermind, then hidden among them was an accomplice. The evening was the opportunity to catch him. Very quickly, everyone had arrived. Catherine announced the rules. Everyone would take turns answering George's questions, and wrong answers would be penalized. She pulled a handgun from her bag, stating bluntly, "Tonight, someone will not be able to walk out of this house." The black woman sharply noticed the rug under the table had been replaced. Seems the hosts weren't joking. The atmosphere on the scene instantly dropped to freezing point. But to save their lives, they could only reluctantly participate. George asked the black woman first, "When did you start fooling around with Freddie?" Freddie's affair partner turned out to be the black woman. Clarissa immediately felt waves of nausea. The black woman honestly admitted it was about 7 or 8 weeks ago. Next, Freddie and Clarissa both passed the test smoothly. Finally, only James remained. George asked him, "That night, did you intentionally throw the movie ticket in the trash, wanting George to suspect Catherine?" James refused to admit it. George continued to expose him. Initially, it was certainly Arthur who proposed the plan to steal Severus to James, because this was most beneficial for destabilizing the situation in Moscow, and could also take the opportunity to implicate Catherine and kick George out of the game, truly killing 3 birds with 1 stone. Later, James stole Severus and lured Catherine to Zurich, making her think she was going there to retrieve the Severus virus. Then, that night, he threw the movie ticket in the trash, causing suspicion for George so he would discover Catherine's schedule. James guessed George would ask Clarissa for help redirecting the satellite to monitor Catherine, then seized the opportunity of the satellite surveillance window to let Vadim go. Finally, pinning the blame of betrayal onto George. This plan, though cunning, overlooked one fatal issue. James personally opened that account in Myanmar. George then took out a stack of photos. On them were images of James appearing at the Myanmar bank. Seeing this, James no longer denied it, snatched the gun, admitting he did all these things. But he was the one who was right. This was clearly a great opportunity to weaken Russia. For that purpose, he didn't even hesitate to use poison to kill the superior. But now, as long as he doesn't confess, it's all just speculation. But George unilaterally redirecting the spy satellite is a fact, enough for him to spend the rest of his life in prison. As a result, James didn't expect that George, this old fox, had secretly planted a recording device and the gun he held was fake. The situation instantly reversed. Afterward, George wrapped James's body in the rug and threw it into the wild fishing spot. Arthur, the one who did wrong, didn't dare speak up, could only treat James's disappearance as an accident. George and Catherine's life returned to normal. The story ends here. This film is not just a spy mission, but also an interrogation of humanity, marriage, and loyalty. The film centers on the crisis of trust between the agent couple, weaving a web full of political conspiracies and emotional entanglements. When Catherine is accused of treason, George is forced to choose between national duty and marital vows. This setup transcends the binary oppositions of traditional spy films, shifting instead to explore suspicion within intimate relationships, how it destroys the foundation of trust. For audiences seeking thrilling sensations, this non-entertaining approach might feel a bit dry. But for fans who appreciate profound plots, this is precisely the film's precious value. Thank you for watching this video. What do you think of this film? Please leave a comment below the video.